Ching stares intently at the monster in front of her who assaulted her. She uses her hand as an invisible brush to cast the most terrifying curse on him. But nobody cares about the girl's actions. Then she angrily closes her eyes amid the frantic shouting of the Japanese soldiers and the cold ruthlessness of the traitors. She leaves behind only that terrifying curse and an overwhelming resentment that takes decades to dissipate. Decades later, the story moves to a medical school in Hong Kong, China. Professor Lam is a famous teacher and researcher at the medical school. Recently, he always feels a pair of eyes watching him at home, but cannot find the source. And these past few days, he even suffers from insomnia. As someone who always believes in science, he does not care at first and still goes to the university to teach as usual. The subject Professor Lam studies is exactly the hot topic of sleep in neuroscience. It turns out Professor Lam always believes that sleep takes up a massive amount of human time, which greatly reduces the time humans spend on developing civilization. He hopes to find out how to keep humans energetic without needing sleep. But the dean stops this research because sleep experiments violate humanity. He yells that they are pedantic and cynical. Despite losing his experimental funding, Professor Lam still believes his research is revolutionary. He still goes his own way in private. But before, he always conducted his research on animals. The only thing missing is a human specimen for study. Right then, his phone suddenly rings. The caller is his ex-girlfriend Monique, whom he met in Venice 10 years ago. The ex-girlfriend invites him out for a meal. When asked about her purpose, Monique bluntly says that Professor Lam's mentor told her to find him. It turns out Monique is a patient of Professor Lam's mentor. Her older brother has suffered from insomnia for many years. He has not slept for over 40 consecutive days. Now he becomes hyperactive and moody. Their whole family believes the older brother is under an evil spell. On March 29, 1990, they hire a sorcerer to exorcise the older brother. Unexpectedly, the older brother suddenly sits up and severely injures 2 pieces of flesh on the sorcerer's nose. As the younger sister Monique also feels the pain brought by insomnia herself while seeking medical help everywhere. Coincidentally, Professor Lam's mentor recommended Professor Lam to her when he passed away. Hearing Monique's purpose, Professor Lam asks her about her older brother's basic situation.
没有几个医生知道这个怪病，就算知道，也未必懂得怎么治。
你不是在说特殊性失眠症吧？
Knowing that her older brother is actually the rarest type of specific insomnia patient in his research field, Professor Lam's eyes light up, because this is exactly the living specimen he urgently needs. He cannot wait to rush to Malaysia with Monique. Unexpectedly, an accident happens just as they arrive at the ward doors. Monique's older brother runs screaming out of the ward into the street and is brutally hit and killed by a speeding car. Seeing the living specimen slip through his fingers and die, Professor Lam does not lose heart. He takes advantage of the hospital's relaxed vigilance to sneak up to the older brother's corpse, examine his brain, and secretly take it out of the hospital. After returning home, he soaks the brain specimen in chemical solution and packs it into a durian shell, preparing to bring it back to Hong Kong. Coincidentally, Monique arrives downstairs at his house at this moment, so Professor Lam hurriedly changes their meeting spot to a cafe. He originally thinks Monique is here to settle scores with him, but unexpectedly, she gives him a check covering the entire funding for his experiment. It turns out Monique heard her sister-in-law mention it before. Her grandfather once changed his surname, so he must have done something heinous to be cursed by someone. He tells her that if she thinks her older brother is possessed, she can find someone to exorcise him. But if he is cursed, the spell will definitely affect his body and make him unable to sleep. He adds that if she cannot find anyone to lift this curse, then they must use scientific methods. Now that her older brother has died tragically, she is unwilling to admit that her family is under an evil spell. And recently, she and her second older brother are also deeply trapped in the nightmare of insomnia. She hopes to solve this problem through scientific methods, so she comes to find Professor Lam. This money is exactly what her second older brother asked her to hand over on his behalf. Hearing Monique's words, Professor Lam does not hesitate at all and immediately returns to Hong Kong to start researching the brain specimen. He discovers that the thalamus of the specimen has shrunk by 60%, and nearly 90% of the brain lacks protein. Thus, he reaches a shocking conclusion. He states that if there is any insomnia curse in this world, then it must be an evil spell that affects the thalamus. At this time, Professor Lam, who has been continuously troubled by insomnia, suddenly remembers Monique's words.
那时候，大妈跟我说，爸爸肯定是中了降头。那些巫师说， 我们全家人都中了奖。
The tragic scene of his father dying from insomnia is still vivid in his mind. He does not know whether his father was ever cursed by anyone. With an attitude of giving it a try, Professor Lam comes to a spirit medium stall and provides his father's exact birth time. After an intense summoning session, the spirit medium opens her eyes and begins to recount this past event sealed for 40 years. At that time, it is the period of the National War of Resistance. The Japanese soldiers go door to door on the streets, searching for comfort women. When arriving at Professor Lam's father's house, the Japanese soldiers brutally break in. At this time, a Japanese sentence suddenly blurted out by the father draws the attention of the Japanese colonel. Coincidentally, the Japanese soldiers also find several Japanese novels in the father's house. During this critical period, the Japanese army desperately needs talents who understand both Chinese and Japanese. The father is exactly this kind of person. The colonel looks at him with appreciation and tells him to report for duty at the military camp the next day. The father originally does not want to work for the Japanese invaders. However, the lack of cooking rice at home the next day completely extinguishes the fire of justice he holds in his heart. Just like that, the father becomes a translator. But in the eyes of his neighbors, this is no different from being a traitor. To make up for his guilt, Lam Sing gives his extra rice and meat to his neighbors, but is met with their scolding and cold stares. After working for the Japanese army for a long time, Lam Sing is recommended by the colonel to the Hong Kong Charity Association due to his excellent performance. The so-called Charity Association is actually a notorious comfort women recruitment center. It specifically rounds up young women to satisfy the animalistic desires of the Japanese soldiers. The president of the Charity Association, Chow Fook, is also a traitor. On his first day at the Charity Association, Lam Sing sees a comfort woman in the room, refusing to follow orders and biting a Japanese soldier. She is immediately pinned down on the bed by the crowd. The Japanese soldiers prepare to inject her with a syringe of morphine. Lam Sing sees all of this. Unexpectedly, the woman suddenly goes berserk at this moment. She angrily bites off her tongue and rushes in front of Lam Sing, spilling a mouthful of blood. The scene is both terrifying and heartbreaking. Seeing the tragic fate of these comfort women, Lam Sing thinks for a long time, but is powerless to change the situation. One day, he delivers food to the comfort women. A few of them beg him to let them out. He thinks of the demonic actions of the Japanese army and the tragic endings of the comfort women. Lam Sing is deeply shocked. He also wants to do something. So he finally chooses to get the guarding soldiers drunk with alcohol and then releases these unfortunate girls. Unexpectedly, just as the girls run onto the street, they are discovered by the patrolling Japanese soldiers. Following a few gunshots, the girls fall into a pool of blood and only one escapes. But this also makes the Japanese colonel exceptionally furious, and he orders Chow Fook to catch 40 more to make up for the loss. The depressed Chow Fook comes to the old man's house to seek medical treatment. The old man is a famous local feng shui master who is proficient in Taoist secret arts. He has a pair of twin daughters who are young and beautiful. Because it is currently the peak period for the Japanese army to catch comfort women, the two sisters are locked in the attic by their father. Because of an accident, the older daughter has her eye color changed and becomes a girl with heterochromia, so she has been learning Taoist magic from her father since childhood, while the younger daughter is sent to school to read and write. Exactly because of this, the older daughter develops thoughts of unfair fate in her heart. The bullying Chow Fook is arrogant and domineering as soon as he enters the door. But the old man shows no fear and directly refuses to treat the traitor. In a great rage, Chow Fook orders his subordinates to punch and kick the old man. Hearing the noise, the two sisters in the attic can no longer hold their temper. They hurriedly run down to protect their father, but unexpectedly, this also exposes their whereabouts. Looking at the young and beautiful twin sisters in front of him, Chow Fook, who is currently catching comfort women to report for duty, has his eyes light up and immediately takes the two sisters away. At the Japanese army's banquet, the Japanese colonel invites many traitors, including Lam Sing, and brings out the newly caught comfort women. Looking at the helpless and honest Lam Sing, the colonel deliberately pulls him out and lets him choose one of the twin sisters to take away. Lam Sing thinks of the old man's dying instructions, and in his fear and panic, he randomly grabs the younger sister's hand. While the older sister is undoubtedly chosen by the colonel himself and becomes the victim of this transaction, However, the older sister's heterochromia scares the colonel when he is committing violence. Chow Fook, who is reprimanded by the colonel, turns to vent his anger on the older sister. But just as he pins her on the bed to vent his lust, the older sister calmly draws a magic talisman in the air. Although her face shows no emotion, anyone with a discerning eye knows that it is a curse which is the older sister's final stubbornness and resistance. The unaware Chow Fook smiles and immediately puts a hood over the older sister's head and hands her over to the brutal Japanese army. Meanwhile, although Lam Sing takes in the younger sister, but he lives in regret and fear every day. To make some compensation to the two sisters, he takes food to find the older sister in the comfort camp. The older sister questions him why he became a traitor to serve the Japanese and why he chose her younger sister back then.
因为他在我旁边啊。
因为命运是不公平的。
Lam Sing stammers and cannot speak. Perhaps out of a burst of anger towards Lam Sing for not choosing her, almost no one notices that the older sister draws another magic talisman in the air at the last moment. The older sister cursed two people in total. One is the incredibly beastly and inhumane Chow Fook, and the other is the timid and cowardly but kind-hearted Lam Sing. Eventually, Lam Sing falls into the panic of insomnia. Lam Sing's wife, who is exactly the younger twin sister from back then, knows that her older sister cast a curse on her husband. To lift the curse, the old woman takes the young Professor Lam to the mass grave and finds the older sister's corpse to beg for forgiveness. Unexpectedly, this is completely useless. As Lam Sing's symptoms become increasingly severe, he even rushes into the Japanese military camp and fatally strikes the Japanese colonel with a flurry of knife slashes. He himself also meets a tragic end. After hearing this story about his father, Professor Lam obviously feels much more relieved. After leaving the spirit medium, he takes out the heptapeptide protein A, developed by his master to save Monique. This thing has a miraculous effect on repairing brain proteins. Sure enough, Monique's condition improves significantly after taking this medicine. But at this moment, she suddenly learns that her grandfather is actually the extremely wicked Chow Fook from back then. Because he did too many heinous things, he changed his surname and fled to Malaysia. Her encounter with Professor Lam is entirely destined, which is heaven's most reasonable arrangement for this sin spanning half a century. After learning about this, Professor Lam surprisingly no longer wants to save Monique. He silently replaces the heptapeptide protein A with a stimulating gas. This ultimately causes Monique to feel anxious and panicked until she goes completely insane. Professor Lam watches all this on the surveillance monitor. However, when he sees Monique spiraling into madness and biting her own arm, he suddenly realizes in a daze that her face overlaps with the face of the older twin sister. Professor Lam knows that the curse cannot be broken. The older sister carries too much resentment. This is retribution for the descendants of the Chow and Lam families. Finally, Professor Lam holds Monique's body and frantically spirals into madness, as if telling the world that all the sins originate from himself. His humanity completely collapses at this moment, not only because his heart is morally condemned, but also out of a retaliatory madness against the impermanence of fate. Finally, the police car takes Professor Lam away. Amid the blaring police sirens, Professor Lam smiles as he finally escapes the torment of insomnia. But what he does not know is that his laboratory is actually built on the grave of the older twin sister. This horror movie, released in 2017, is their third collaboratively created restricted horror film after their previous works. Through an ordinary narrative, it depicts the inhumane side of the traitors in the Japanese army during the War of Resistance. Finally, using the concept of karmic retribution, it interprets the simple truth that every cause has a consequence. It also uses the horror genre to portray the indelible historical trauma and the wickedness of human nature during that war. See you next time.